The Cossacks seem to have coalesced into major groups or hosts around the 14th and 15th century. Fierce warriors and master horsemen, they have wonderful traditions in dance, music and swordsmanship. For hundreds of years they guarded the steppe frontier, with lance, bow and saber against nomadic incursions. A fiery and independent people, living in the river basins of the vast Eurasian plains, they had always been stout supporters of the Russian monarchy and Orthodox religion. Yet, by 1943 around 15 to 20,000 Cossacks were serving in the 1st Cossack Division in the invading German army. By 1945 this had expanded into the 15th SS Cossack Corps consisting of 2 divisions and 25 to 30,000 men. The Germans considered them fantastic and fierce warriors, who had unparalleled riding skills. They were constantly amazed by their tricks and displays on horseback, their ferocious cavalry charges and deep camaraderie. This fascinating unit was led and created by Major General Helmuth Von Pannwitz, an officer of extraordinary compassion, courage, intelligence and ability. He single-handedly brought about the existence of this unit, and was a major champion of Slav rights in the German army. In time, he would be elected by the Cossack soldiers as Feldataman, supreme commander of all Cossack forces. A title last held by Tsarevich Alexei, the son of Tsar Nicholas II. The 10th Cossack Corps had soldiers from every host and included such legendary figures as the traitor Ivan Kononov, the activist Nicholas Nazarenko and wooden-legged Nicholas Kulakov. Émigré officers, who had fled the Soviet Union, came from all over Europe, from Paris, Belgrade and Bucharest and enlisted in their ranks. In their exile, they had often attended some of Europe's finest military colleges, in preparation for a moment like this. The men came from all over Cossakia. The Cossack 1st Division's regiments were actually divided up by geographical origin. For example, the 1st Brigade was composed of 2 Don regiments and a Siberian regiment. The 2nd Brigade consisted of the 2 Kuban regiments and a Terek regiment. Each regiment had roughly 2,000 Cossacks with 150 Germans attached, and was led by a traditional Cossack ataman, equipped with German weapons. Their basic uniform was the German field grey blouse and trousers with special stripes, made from the traditional colors of the Cossack hosts. They were provided with the standard-issue German helmet and the regulation German garrison cap. Uniquely, however, the Don and Siberian Cossacks were allowed, even encouraged to wear the papacha, the traditional Cossack lamb's wool hat, and the Kuban and Terek Cossacks, the Kubanka, the similar but shorter hat. Some of the soldiers, both German and Cossack, for ceremonial occasions wore the Cossack overgarment, the Cherkaska. Whilst this garment was always used by the Cossack atamans. It was worn in the traditional style, complete with the decorative cartridge holders in front. Pannwitz made it clear to the Germans in his division that they would be adapting to Cossack customs. This was a Cossack division staffed by some Germans, not a German division made up of Cossacks. Orders were given out in both German and Russian. Cultural orientation lectures were given to new soldiers and there was even a division weekly newspaper, the Cossack Call. Portable field altars were provided that permitted the regular scheduling of Orthodox masses. They sang traditional songs and Orthodox hymns, which Pannwitz against regulation encouraged German soldiers to attend. Pannwitz primarily chose Baltic Germans as officers, who could speak Russian and act as interpreters if need be, and Austrians, as it was thought they were more used to Slavic customs. The tact and diplomacy Pannwitz showed in creating this unit was incredible. This was truly a Cossack unit in the German army. As one officer stated, in dealing with these people a man had to learn something new every day or else he was out of place. Men who arrived without any preconceived opinions always had to keep their minds open for new impressions and new views. Ever sensitive to the customs and traditions of the Cossacks, von Pannwitz created his own Praetorian Guard composed of soldiers who had previously served with the Tsarist army. Like the ataman officers, the convoy of the general all wore traditional Cossack uniforms. According to one German officer, they distinguished themselves by their exemplary military conduct and their total devotion to their commander. General von Grollmann, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, best summarized the situation. After seeing the division, he said, "It seems like another world to me here." In essence, this was probably the most significant factor in the success of the Germans with the Cossack division. They had created another world, with all of the appropriate accoutrements and trappings. The Cossacks were mostly employed fighting Broz Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia, where they performed admirably. They even nearly captured Tito himself. They freed German troops from encirclement at Glina and Sisak, among other great actions. They smashed the Red Army at Pitomacha, before finally surrendering to the British in 1945, in the closing days of the war. The tale of the 15th Cossack Corps and its two divisions is in essence inseparable from the story of Helmuth von Pannwitz. Pannwitz was born in 1898, into an aristocratic family in Silesia, a region which today is in Poland but back then was in Germany. His ancestral estate lay directly on the German-Russian border. Pannwitz and his two brothers were apparently fascinated by the Cossacks who patrolled the border. They always arranged to be on the banks of the little river when the Cossacks were watering their horses. The Cossacks liked the three Pannwitz boys and frequently talked to them and gave them small gifts. The Pannwitz watched with avid fascination as they sang songs and played the balalaika, a traditional string instrument. On one occasion, supposedly, a Cossack placed Helmut on a steppe pony, and the boy rode off at a wild gallop, finally returning from this adventure late in the evening. Helmut visited the Cossack barracks on several occasions and ate with the soldiers. After the meal, he was treated to the traditional songs and displays of swordsmanship. As a young, impressionable boy, not yet in his teens, these experiences with the Cossacks left an indelible impression on him. At the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Pannwitz immediately volunteered. He served with distinction on the Galician front, being swiftly promoted from ensign to lieutenant and was awarded the Iron Cross second and first class for bravery. By 1926, he was managing estates in Poland, where it was said he treated the Polish farm laborers particularly well. By the outbreak of World War II, he was back in the army, by now a major. He again served with distinction in the Polish campaigns. In 1941, now a lieutenant colonel, he led a forward regiment during Operation Barbarossa. He was very popular with his men who called him Der Pan, and his abilities were quickly noted by his superiors. By late 1941 he had fallen ill and was forced into an advisory role behind the front lines. From there he quickly began developing his own plans for the employment of Soviet volunteers. Pannwitz had a deep love for Slavic customs, language and beliefs. He despised the way Nazi policies labeled many Soviet peoples as Untermenschen or subhumans. Instead, he wanted to encourage cooperation between German and Soviet peoples alike. His efforts began to swiftly concentrate on the Cossacks, who he had known well as a boy. The Cossacks were targeted for recruitment for a number of reasons. They were a warrior culture who had a long history of anti-Bolshevism. They had often fought in the White Army during the Russian Civil War and had suffered disastrously under Soviet collectivization policies which had damaged their traditional way of life. The Soviets stripped them of their traditional military privileges and enacted a brutal process of decossacization in the 1920s, which attempted to repress, exterminate and destroy their communities. Further, many Nazi officials were more amenable to their use as soldiers because they were considered racially different to Slavs. Finally, Pannwitz undoubtedly had a personal connection and interest in these people. By late 1942, Pannwitz had received backing from Kurt von Seitzler for the formation of a Cossack division. On 20th of September 1942 Pannwitz flew around the Don, Terek and Kuban areas of Russia that had now been overrun by German forces and began forging ties with Cossack leaders. He was extremely successful in this regard and managed to secure the support of Terek Ataman Nicholas Lazarevich Kulakov, a soldier who would swiftly prove a superb officer and champion of the Cossack cause. Kulakov had fought against the Reds in the Russian Civil War. In 1920, he was injured by grenade fragments and had both legs amputated. He managed to get back home, but the Red Army secret police tracked him down. His wife concealed him in a hastily dug cellar and feigned his death. For 20 years he lived below their house, fashioning himself two wooden legs. When the Germans overran the Caucasus in 1942, Kulakov rose from underground and immediately helped lead a rebellion, joining forces with the enterprising von Pannwitz. The nature of the Cossack division was initially kept secret to avoid the ire of higher-ups who were extremely suspicious of recruiting Soviet citizens. Thus the unit was initially given the name Cavalry Task Force Pannwitz. After the German disaster at Stalingrad, Pannwitz was briefly forced to change assignments. He now had to cover the southern flank of Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group. With characteristic energy he organized a force of 1,000 ragtag men, and quickly smashed two Soviet divisions in combat. As a result, von Pannwitz was awarded the Oak Leaves for his Knight's Cross. On January 15, 1943, he traveled to Berlin to receive it in a private audience with the Führer. Hitler immediately asked him, "How are things with your Cossacks?" Pannwitz immediately took this as cue to voice his opinions, and he told Hitler that the treatment of Slavic peoples as Untermenschen was despicable and the war against Bolshevism could only be won with their help. Hitler listened politely and immediately dismissed him. This forthright and heretical display could have cost Pannwitz everything. It should be noted that a number of Cossacks were serving in small specialized units all over the Eastern Front. For example, Nicholas Nazarenko led a group of militia men over to the German side in 1941. He attacked the Soviet Ninth Army from behind at the River Meuse and managed to persuade General von Wiedersheim to employ his men in a reconnaissance role. Ivan Kononev defected with the entire 436th Regiment to the Wehrmacht and was allowed by General von Schenkendorf to form a mixed Russian Cossack regiment that peaked at about 1,500 men. The debate whether to make use of Russian volunteers, as the Germans called them, for combat, or labor roles raged in the German army as the war in the Eastern Front progressed and the need for manpower became more dire. Generally speaking, Hitler and a number of other prominent Nazis disliked the idea, as they thought Soviet citizens would be too unreliable. Nevertheless, according to General Helmuth, by March 1943 there were 430,000 known Eastern volunteers serving with the Wehrmacht. This number was subdivided as follows. Eastern battalions, Cossacks etc., 75,000 men. Turkestani Legion 42,000 men. Other volunteers 310,000 men. It should be mentioned, however, that this is a rough figure. Many Cossacks were likely misidentified and they were not serving in specialized units but instead scattered all over the place. Returning to the front quickly, after meeting Hitler in April 1943, Pannwitz organized the defense of Feodosia. Before he joined forces with an old comrade Hans Joachim von Schultz and returned to his Cossack mission. Finally, on April 23 he got official approval from High Command for his new division. He was told to train them at Milau, a former Polish city, which had Polish army facilities nearby. Some 10 to 15,000 Cossacks gathered at Kherson on the Eastern Front. These included Freiherr von Wolf's detachment from Poltava, von Jungschultz's men from Kiev, Kononev's 600-strong detachment, Nazarenko's 500 men from Rostov, Ataman Kulakov's Terex, and finally Cavalry Task Force Pannwitz. Once they traveled to Milau, the Germans also began searching prisoner of war camps for additional Cossacks. The mere claim to Cossack identity was not sufficient to gain membership. Records show interrogations were conducted by experienced interpreters who probed the volunteers' background in detail. Further, the division became a rallying call for Cossacks from around Europe. Any Cossacks the Eastern Command could find were rounded up and quickly sent to Milau. Many of the Cossacks brought their wives and children with them. Thus Milau became the home of thousands of Cossack families. This initially caused a little trouble, but Pannwitz quickly adapted and settled them in well. A cadet school was formed which in turn, when boys turned of age, could supply volunteers to a replacement regiment. Pannwitz personally took a liking to a young orphan boy named Boris, whose parents had been killed. He hoped to adopt him after the war. Their first assignment was to guard the railway and roads between Zagreb and Belgrade, an area heavily infested with partisans. Tito's partisans were highly organized and numbered nearly 220,000 men, operating in strength from the Muslavina, Kordun and Shumharak river regions. On October 5, 1943 the Cossack Division was assigned to the 69th Reserve Corps, just in time for the division to prepare for its first major tactical assignment, Operation Fruska Gora. The purpose of the operation was to break the partisans' stranglehold over the Fruska Gora area. The Cossack Division began its attack on October 12. Von Pannwitz exercised strong personal leadership and flew daily in his Fessler Stork liaison plane to various parts of the front to observe the battle and issue orders directly to the various commanders. According to records, the Cossacks performed admirably. During the summer of 1943, Field Marshal von Weichs had planned for an offensive against Tito, composed of a number of campaigns ranging in the eastern half of the county. In keeping with this strategy, the division participated in Operation Wild Sow, and at the end of December, Operation Santa Claus. Again the Cossacks performed exceptionally well. The elements in Croatia earned the nickname, the North Croatian Fire Brigade, as a result of their ability to move quickly to crisis situations. The Cossacks were well suited to anti-partisan campaigns. They were skillful in staging ambushes, recognizing partisan traps and executing flanking and rear attacks in contrast to frontal assaults. However, the Cossack Division did have a number of problems which concerned the Germans. The Germans found it virtually impossible to prevent looting, which had been a traditional privilege of theirs for centuries, as well as the copious consumption of captured alcohol. In the end Pannwitz was forced to ban the latter entirely. During late 1943, the Cossacks fought successfully to keep the rail line between Zagreb and Brod open. When partisans had encircled German and Croatian troops between Gilan and Sisak, the Cossack freed these forces with great skill. Despite the bitter partisan war, the Cossacks did engage in traditional activities. The 2nd Brigade, stationed north of Brod, often enjoyed wild boar hunting. whilst the Terek Regiment built a riding course for Hubertus Day on November the 3rd and performed various cavalry contests. By now the Germans had learned that Tito's HQ was in Var. Destroying the HQ and capturing Tito would cripple the partisan effort. The Germans planned Operation Roselsprung, a combined air and land assault on the base. The air assault was spearheaded by an SS parachute battalion around 500 strong. At 7 a.m. on the morning of May 25, the SS dropped into Dvar with ground forces, whilst the Cossack division supported the attack. The operation was a great success, but Tito managed to escape, thanks to the fierce resistance of his soldiers. The Cossacks had been sent to the Balkans to separate them from the Soviet front, which had now arrived in the region. The most significant engagement occurred on December 25, 1944, when the 133rd Soviet Infantry Division launched an attack on the Pitomacha region by the river Drava. They met them here, and with great ferocity fought them to a standstill. By late 1944 Himmler had taken an active interest in Pannwitz and his Cossack division. He was fascinated by these warrior people and more amenable to their incorporation into the German war machine. At the end of the year he called Pannwitz to a conference and suggested the division be moved into the SS. When Himmler proposed this transfer, von Pannwitz replied very simply and directly, "I have been in the army since I was 15. To leave it now would seem to me like desertion." An agreement was eventually reached, however, meaning that the Cossack Corps would be placed under SS administration. In terms of replacement and supplies, Pannwitz knew this was the best way to get the equipment his men needed, otherwise their unique mix of Wehrmacht and Cossack uniforms and ranks would remain intact. On those terms the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps was formed on February 25, 1945, composed of the 1st and 2nd Cossack divisions. A 3rd division was even planned, but the war's end would put it close to this. With this reorganization, von Pannwitz had achieved his goal. Virtually all of the Cossack troops in German service were under his jurisdiction. He had by now been elected Feldataman, military leader of all Cossacks. An astonishing achievement for any single man, but for a German and member of a foreign army, this fact beggars belief. He had done the extraordinary and had created a corps of non-Germans that was a first-rate addition to the German military machine. He had earned the admiration and loyalty of the Cossacks, a fearsome and brilliant people. An ambition which he had no doubt incubated since his early boyhood, when he first saw these curious horsemen ride along the river banks opposite his home. But it was all too late, for neither the German nor Cossack cause could prevail in this war. On March 9, 1945, the Cossack Corps fulfilled their final duty and supported a German offensive in Hungary by launching their own attack against a bridgehead at Valpovo on the river Drava. Here they achieved their minor objective. By now it was clear that Germany had totally lost the war. Pannwitz began to move his men west, towards the Americans and British, hoping he could surrender to them. The Soviets usually executed any citizens they suspected of collaboration. Pannwitz maintained hopes he could save his soldiers. In late April 1945 he spoke with his confidant Schultz on the matter. "You know my opinion, Schultz, the English are neither blind nor stupid. They know the value of seasoned and loyal Eastern troops in a possible campaign against the Soviets." Schultz wisely replied, "I fear the Kremlin knows this much better. It cannot afford to let such a lesson stand. It must obliterate it. Neither Churchill nor Truman will go against their good old Uncle Joe for a handful of Cossacks." Schultz was clearly the more realistic of the two. The British Army was correct and polite with dealing with their captives, but largely non-committal about the future of the Cossacks. The traditional response given, "Wait until an official decision has been made." In reality, the decision for the myriad of displaced Soviet persons had already been made, when the big three powers had met to discuss arrangements for the end of the war at the Yalta Conference. It was agreed there that all former Soviet citizens would be returned to Soviet authorities, wherever they were found. The fate of von Pannwitz and his Cossacks had been sealed. All that remained was the flexibility the British would exercise in implementing the agreements. The Cossack Corps officially surrendered to the British 6th Armoured Division at a farmhouse between Vauckermarkt and Wolfsburg. In the next few days, von Pannwitz made every effort to ensure that his men would remain in the custody of the Western powers. He repeatedly contacted every available ranking British officer and attempted to have his Cossacks transferred away. The British disliked their task but they would not budge. And the unit was soon handed over to the Soviets. In this period a few managed to escape, such as Nicholas Nazarenko, or argued that they were not Soviet citizens and thus did not come under the provisions of the British-Soviet agreement. Many of the Germans did not qualify either and also evaded capture. It is said that von Pannwitz was offered amnesty, but that he refused this option, believing his place was with his men and people. Taken back to the Soviet Union, the bulk of the corps went into what Solzhenitsyn called the turbid streams of our sewage system. Von Pannwitz was accused of war crimes and sentenced to death. He was hanged alongside many other officers on 16 January 1947. Most of the remaining officers and enlisted ranks perished in the atrocious conditions of the labor camps. A few survived and were released after Stalin's death in 1953. This, however, marked the final end of the German Cossacks and their strange tale in World War II.